Imagine a country where most people are farmers, living on very low incomes, with almost no modern industry, very few cars, and very little connection to the outside world. That was China just a few decades ago. Today, the same country is the world's second largest economy, a global manufacturing powerhouse, and a serious competitor to the United States. So how did China go from poor to rich so fast? In this video, we're going to rewind China's economic story, from poverty and isolation to reform, factories, skyscrapers, and high-speed trains. And most importantly, we'll see what decisions turned China into an economic giant. Let's start in the 1970s. Back then, China was a very different country. The government tightly controlled everything. Most people worked in agriculture under a collective farming system. Private business was almost impossible. The country had just come out of political chaos and economic disaster. Incomes were low, productivity was weak, and China was largely closed off from global trade and investment. For many families, life meant hard physical work and very simple living. Then, something huge happened. Leadership changed, and so did the mindset. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping emerged as the key figure in Chinese politics. He brought a simple but powerful idea. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. In other words, ideology matters less than results. If something makes people richer and the country stronger, try it. This idea became the foundation for China's economic reforms. China started by changing the way farming worked. Instead of forcing farmers to work collectively and take equal shares, the government introduced a system where land was still owned by the state, but families could manage their own plots. They could grow their own crops, sell extra output in the market, and keep the profit. This change sounds small, but it was revolutionary. Suddenly, farmers had a direct reason to work harder and be more productive. The result was dramatic. Food production increased. Rural incomes rose. For the first time in decades, many families began to see real improvement in their living standards. This early success sent a clear signal. Giving people incentives works. But China didn't stop at agriculture. The leadership had a bigger vision. The next step was opening up to the world. China had been isolated for a long time, but now it wanted technology, investment, and trade. To attract all that, it created something new, special economic zones, or SEZs. Cities like Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen were turned into experimental zones. Inside these zones, rules were different. Foreign companies could invest, factories could be built, taxes could be lower, and business could operate with much more freedom than the rest of the country. The idea was simple. Create small islands of capitalism inside a socialist country and see what happens. What happened was explosive growth. Shenzhen is the best example. In the late 1970s, it was just a small fishing village near Hong Kong. Today, it's a megacity with skyscrapers, tech companies, and millions of people. Factories in the SEZs started producing clothing, toys, electronics, and all kinds of cheap products for the rest of the world. Global brands started outsourcing production to China because labor was cheap, infrastructure was improving, and the government was supportive. Slowly, China became the factory of the world. This manufacturing boom created millions of jobs. Rural workers moved to cities in massive numbers to work in factories. Wages were low by Western standards, but much higher than what many workers could earn in the countryside. As a result, urbanization accelerated, cities expanded, new apartment blocks, roads, and shopping streets appeared. For many people, their first real salary came from a factory paycheck. Behind this transformation was not just cheap labor, but also a government that was very focused on growth. China invested heavily in infrastructure: highways, ports, railways, airports, and power plants. Building infrastructure served two purposes. First, it created jobs. Second, it made production and trade more efficient. A well-connected country can move goods faster, cheaper, and more reliably. This gave China a huge advantage over many other developing countries. At the same time, China used long-term planning. Every few years, the government introduced a new 5-year plan that laid out priorities, which industries to support, which regions to develop, and what kinds of technology to focus on. This top-down planning gave businesses and local governments a sense of direction. They knew where the country wanted to go, and they adjusted their strategies accordingly. Another important factor in China's rise was its focus on export-led growth. Instead of focusing mainly on its own domestic market at the beginning, China set out to produce goods for the whole world. It created export processing zones where factories could assemble products using imported parts and then ship them abroad. The more they exported, the more foreign currency China earned. This foreign currency was used to buy technology, machines, and resources. Joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 was a turning point. Membership in the WTO meant that China had to follow global trade rules, but it also meant much easier access to international markets. Tariffs dropped, trade barriers fell, and foreign companies became even more comfortable investing in China. In the years that followed, China's exports surged. Western consumers, attracted by low prices, bought Chinese-made goods in massive quantities. But factories and exports are only part of the story. Over time, China began to climb the value chain. At first, China focused on low-cost, labor-intensive products. But gradually, it started moving into more advanced industries, electronics, machinery, automobiles, and later, high-tech sectors like smartphones, telecommunications equipment, renewable energy, and electric vehicles. Chinese companies that once assembled products designed by others began to create their own brands and technologies. Companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, BYD, and many others emerged as global players. This shift from made in China to designed in China, and eventually innovated in China, is a key part of how the country moved from poor to relatively rich. Urbanization played a central role in this transformation. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural villages to growing cities. This migration did several things at once. It supplied factories with labor. It created a huge internal consumer market, and it pushed local governments to build housing, transport, and services. Over time, large cities became engines of growth, innovation, and productivity. As incomes rose, China's middle class began to grow. People who once struggled to meet basic needs could now afford better housing, education, healthcare, and consumer goods. Shopping malls, e-commerce platforms, and service industries expanded rapidly. Domestic consumption became an increasingly important part of the economy, slowly balancing the earlier dependence on exports. Another important layer of China's rise was education. China invested heavily in schools, universities, and technical training. Over time, this created a large pool of engineers, scientists, and skilled workers. These people powered the growth of technology, manufacturing, and research-intensive industries. Education allowed China to move beyond simple assembly and become more innovative and competitive in advanced sectors. Of course, China's poor-to-rich story is not perfect or simple. The growth model also created problems: regional inequality, environmental damage, high levels of debt, and social tension. Some coastal cities became much richer than inland regions. Pollution from factories and coal-fired power plants damaged air and water. Real estate bubbles and local government borrowing raised questions about financial stability. The population is aging, and the workforce is starting to shrink. But despite these challenges, the overall transformation is undeniable. In a few decades, China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. It built modern cities, connected the country with high-speed rail, became a leader in global trade, and moved into the front lines of technology and innovation. This journey from poor to rich was driven by a combination of factors: economic reforms, opening to the world, export-led growth, massive infrastructure investment, long-term planning, urbanization, and a huge, hardworking population. There's also a political dimension to this story. China's government kept tight control over politics while allowing more freedom in the economy. This authoritarian capitalism model is very different from Western democracies. For some, that raises serious questions about human rights, freedoms, and transparency. For others, it is seen as a highly efficient system for rapid development. Either way, it is a major part of why and how China changed so quickly. So, how did China go from poor to rich? First, by recognizing that the old system was not working and being willing to change. Second, by giving people and businesses stronger incentives to produce, innovate, and trade. Third, by integrating deeply into the global economy, becoming a central hub in global supply chains. And fourth, by continuously upgrading from low-value to higher-value industries and building the skills, infrastructure, and institutions needed for long-term growth. China's story is not over. The country now faces new challenges: slowing growth, rising wages, geopolitical tensions, technological competition, and a changing global order. The next chapter will be different from the last. But its rise from one of the world's poorest nations to a major economic superpower is already one of the most dramatic economic transformations in history. And that is how China went from poor to rich, not through magic, not overnight, but through a long series of deliberate choices, painful adjustments, and powerful economic forces that reshaped the lives of more than 1 billion people.